Arthur is going to talk about a trip to PSM and then a trip to Sardinia, which has got all sorts of extra interesting bits. And this is from 1975, I think. Over to you, Arthur.
Okay. Hopefully you can see my screen now.
Yes, that's coming up very nicely.
Okay, so let's get started then. Thanks very much for your interest in the events of 45 years ago. There's at least probably a dozen of us on the call. And I think some of the things that happened back then in 1975 actually helped to shape activities for the CPC and others over subsequent decades. And I'm hoping to get through these slides in about 40 minutes, so you won't be too weary at the end of it, and maybe we'll have a bit of a discussion, because I've not got a monopoly on the events back then, and I'm sure others have got interesting things to say as well. But anyway, it's quite a complicated story with the Craven Pothole Club and Loughborough University Speleological team running two trips. Well, I was piggybacking onto an American trip to the PSM, and Loughborough were going down to Sardinia. So I'll just give you a bit of background on what happened. Right. See if I can get this to work. There we are. Before the PSM, I'd been on a trip with Judson and John Worley and a few others to Gouffre, Iran, looking for the world's deepest cave. We went down one pitch, and as most people know from having read the book and heard the stories, it sumped. So that was a big disappointment. We came back and thought, well, where else can we go? I know, Mossdale, that's got fantastic potential. So we crawled to the end of Mossdale, and that's Debts or Bang I've got in the ammo tin. And that's another story, but we decided we weren't going to Bang there after all. Next opportunity to go deep was the following year at the Gouffre with Adrian Bridge and various other people who you'll all know, I guess. Particularly John Allenby and Pete Gray, who contributed a lot to that trip. And we managed, by the grace of God, to get to the bottom of the cave using a running ladder technique, which requires an excellent anchor for each pitch. And then we had a double rope, which we left behind to haul up the ladder for the return trip, and the person going up first would self-lifeline. Anyway, it was on a wing and a prayer, but we managed it and had a fantastic time, the 5 or 6 of us that made it down to the bottom. And the following year, I was at visiting the States, family home in Tennessee, just as you might expect from the Beverly Hillbillies, if you remember that show years ago. And then my uncle in Atlanta introduced me to one of his student friends from back years ago, Jim Yeomans, who was a member of the Dogwood City Grotto, and he offered me a job. It's the only job I was ever offered in America, but it was be hanging around on the side of skyscrapers, fixing windows and caulking the joints, and it didn't really appeal to me. But anyway, Jim was a very dynamic guy, and we kept in touch, and he was organising a trip to the PSM. And I got an invitation to join that trip with the newfound American friends. So this is what happened during that particular trip. Set off from, well, I was living in Pudsey then, although the family home was Skipton. I went down to Loughborough, then on to London, and I was going to be hitching down the M1 via Loughborough. With some friends, Chris Murray, who I knew from Loughborough University, as well as Pete and Alison Moody, who were very well known in Mendip. We got the train overnight to Victoria, and then the boat to New Haven. Next day we had a quick look around sites such as the Eiffel Tower, Notre Dame, and then caught another train overnight. And we were too tight or hard up in those days to have a proper carriage for sleeping in, so we just balanced ourselves, wedged ourselves between the bags in the corridor, so it was a very uncomfortable night. But 6:30 next morning, it was time for me to get off the train, and I was going on to the PSM, whereas the other two were heading, the other three, sorry, Chris, Pete and Alison were heading to the Picos de Europa to join a Wessex Caving Club expedition. They had something new going on there. I met up with Ruben Gomez, who in those days was the sort of secretary for RSIP, who controlled access to the PSM. And he gave me a lift to Lick. And there I met up with various people from other caving clubs, which I wasn't expecting. I thought, I wondered what they were all doing there, because we couldn't all have permission to go down the PSM. At least that's how it seemed to me. And the longer I was on my own there, I kept bumping into other people. Obviously, the Americans were coming. There was the BEC, the Eldon, Cambridge, Grampian even. And so it was a very unusual and interesting mix of people. No sign of my American friends. So I was hanging around for 1 or 2 days. But news came through from RSIP that they had just found a new entrance, a top entrance into the PSM, and it now had a depth of 1,270 meters, and that was through the M3 in entrance. Our goal, however, was a bit more modest than that. We were just going to help out generally with RSIP, and we're fairly familiar with some of the stories about the Gouffre de la Pierre Saint Martin, particularly the Lepino shaft, which I think was the original entrance. And I'd read the book Life and Death Underground years ago when I was at Airville School in Skipton. And Ruben Gomez introduced me to somebody called Max Cazines, who was a Belgian balloonist. And he, in 1934, incredibly, he reached a height of 52,000 feet in this contraption. So he was a national hero in Belgium, and he then, around that time, well, it's 1952, when he was leader of the expedition into the PSM via the Lepino shaft, and that's well remembered for the tragic death of Marcel Loubens. It was a mechanical problem with the cable, and he died. And there's a tribute to him in the cave. Anyway, at last the Americans turned up. You can see the names of them there, and the two guys who look like Frenchmen are actually from the BEC. And the main character I want you to focus on is the cat. And we're coming back to the cat, which is just above Jim Yeoman's head. And the cat had a very significant role to play in the discovery of a top entrance to the PSM. Well, the next day we got in cars and rode up to the Pescamu Plateau and set up camp. Well, I was amazed to find that I was the only one with a tent. I can understand the Americans sleeping out under a tarpaulin in the Appalachians in summer, but here we were in the Pyrenees at an altitude of several thousand feet, and it kept snowing and raining, and they had a really rough time of it. But I did have space for one other person to join me in the tent from time to time. Anyway, the next day we were still getting our act together, and nobody was around, and we had this fantastic mountain, Pic de Arlas, immediately behind the camp. And I just set off walking towards it. Before I knew it, although I was in flip-flops, I was at the top of it. And it was an incredible experience to be up there looking across the cloud base towards Pic d'Anny, about 4 miles away. And yeah, I'm not often given to emotion, but I was really struck by that experience. I managed to get down again safely in my flip-flops, and I wouldn't recommend that to anybody else. Anyway, here's an elevation, should I say, of the PSM as it was then, with M3 entrance, which was newly discovered and ran down towards the Tete Sauvage, but they hadn't actually made the link up. And so that was going to be our mission, should we choose to accept it. And so we had this discussion with Ruben Gomez. He's the guy over on the left there. And we agreed that the Americans and myself from the CPC would try and make the link up with the M3 series and survey it. He also gave us a patch of limestone where RSIP would allow us to check out any holes that we found and then report back to them. So we entered the PSM through the Tete Sauvage entrance. It took a while to rig it, and I don't know whether we had permission from the French, but the Americans were very keen to get a free hang of the rope on all the pitches, so we've placed several bolts, 14 hours of hard going, and emerged the next day. So here we are, this is the Tete Sauvage, and I've highlighted it in yellow. You can see a passage going off in yellow to the right, and that's the missing link between the M3 and the PSM, and it was known as about the San Sebastian passage, about 400 meters of missing link there. And so we amped down through Tete Sauvage and went up there surveying as we made progress, and sure enough we found the link point, and Ruben Gomez very thoughtfully left a bottle of champagne for us to enjoy, and so we celebrated on their behalf, and then 11 and a half hours later we settled down, and the next morning we had about 12 hours sleep overnight, and next morning we had a massive breakfast. The Americans seemed to like bacon, and then we proceeded out with our rucksacks. And I find it unbelievable, but back then we were wearing wetsuits for all this, and Fred had the common sense to take off the top part of his wetsuit, and so he made pretty good progress. We were also using the American technique of the day, which was rappel racks and Mitchell boxes, which support your chest level. I'm sure techniques have progressed quite a bit since then. Anyway, we surfaced to the amazing news that not only was the M3 discovered only about less than a fortnight before, but while we'd been underground for a day or two, this cat had wandered off. It had been brought over from a US Army base and gone missing. And Shirley had recruited the two BEC guys, John and Graham, to help find the cat. And they found the cat by a new deep fissure, which was off the beaten track and certainly not permitted as far as Ruben and RSIP were concerned. We should report back to him immediately, and because we were off the grid that was allowed for us to explore. But cavers being cavers, the three of them had dropped a rope down, and it kept going. So there's the where the cat was discovered, and some of you I know have visited this place in subsequent expeditions, but we were the first to go down it, and the BEC lads, because they outnumbered the girl from the US Army base, decided to call it Belfry Pot, and that word in Basque language is painted onto the entrance, as you can see. But it took a big effort to go down there and survey it. But first I was ready for a walk, and here we are off across this very wild terrain, looking back to the peak I mentioned earlier, but heading towards Pic d'Anny. And absolutely fantastic karst landscape. A view out into another wild area, which I believe the French were exploring with very, tough nut cavers who were walking for several hours away from the plateau into wild parts of the Pyrenees. Well, next day we drove down to Molion to update Ruben and confessed that we'd found a big new going cave, but fortunately he was out. Jim Yeomans managed to get the key to the EDF tunnel and unlock the door, because our next objective was to do the big through trip, which the Americans have been fantasizing about for a long time. And with the Tete Sauvage already being rigged, it only took half an hour to get to the bottom. And then about 4.5 hours to get to Tunnel de Vent. It was 11 hours in total, and it was one of the best caving trips I'd ever had up until that point. I'm sure those who've done it would agree. It is a pretty amazing trip, and that's just showing the plan and elevation. So we were right under the Lepino shaft, for example, on the way down to the EDF tunnel. And I'm sure you all know the story of the EDF tunnel, how it was drilled by the electricity company for France, thinking they would use the Salverna as an underground reservoir. But something went wrong with the calculations, and it appeared halfway up the wall of the Salverna rather than at the bottom. But that created a wonderful entrance for cavers to explore, such as we've done. Now, we weren't on a photographic trip. None of us were real photographers, but I've borrowed some pictures here from the South Wales Caving Club, and I'm, giving due credit to them in this slide. But here's their picture of the Salle Suisse, just to give you a feel for the size of the place. The metro, absolutely, fantastic. Even with only 3 or 4 of us and our caving lamps, we got a pretty good impression of the vastness of the cave, and very easy to lose your way at times if you weren't concentrating. And eventually you pop out into the Salverna. There's somebody circled in red right at the bottom of the chamber, and yeah, I think there's obviously tourist potential there, because there's a very easy tunnel to get into that place. I've just circled in red again where the tunnel enters the Salverna. You can see it there at the bottom left. And the Ulster people, as we know, Brooks Brothers and others, Happy Wanderers, had been busy down the bottom end of the system, trying to increase the depth of the cave that way. But ironically, a cat from Germany helped us to increase the depth of the cave with minimal effort compared to what they were doing. So here we are back on the plateau near the ski resorts, and another day of rest, and then setting off to survey SC3, Sumkoi 3. And we went down a series of shafts, and I was in the first part that went down what was the final shaft, the Liberty Bell, and at the bottom there somebody noticed a Wellington boot print, and nearby an inscription made in 1967 by Ruben Gomez, whose name I keep mentioning. So we knew that we'd made a connection into the PSM, and that we've probably had increased the depth of the system overall. Some very big pitches there, and I did have a bad experience halfway down one of the biggest pitches. Stupidly, I'd only got a carbide light, and it went out. I couldn't get it restarted, and I had to tiptoe across a ledge on braille and then reconnect the rack, hoping it was the right way up, and abseiled down in the darkness. Well, I'm still here, but I look back on that and realised just how close a shave it was. Well, at the bottom of the SC3 or Belfry Pot, whatever you want to call it, there was an inlet, and slipping into Northern Caves mode, I crawled off to explore that, and then made a sketch from memory of the different features that I'd encountered. There was a sump or two, but there was also a going passage up a cascade, although it probably just loops back round into the main cave. So soon after the 26th of August, word got out that the British and the Americans had broken the world depth record and pushed it to 1,330 meters. So that was affirming, shall we say. And ironically, things were happening over in the Picos de Europa, which were soon going to dampen our spirits. You may remember that Chris, Pete and Alison had continued to the Wessex expedition, and on the 24th of August there was a trip down the Cueva de la Vega Leoris, which was a going cave. The they'd been down it the year before on ladders, but this year Chris Murray, Pete Moody and Brian Woodward were using SRT techniques. And unlike the Americans, we were still finding our way back then on what would be the best way to do SRT. Everybody knew that you had to avoid rope abrasion and things like that, but sadly something went wrong and Chris fell only about 30 feet on a 150-foot pitch, but he landed badly, and there's no way for the other two to get out to raise the alarm because the rope was dangling 30 feet above their heads, and he died several hours later in the arms of his friends. I'll come back to that later. Anyway, 28th of August, we're winding down now. We visited the resurgence for the PSM in the Caqueta Gorge. This is where it comes out from a waterfall. Tantalising, isn't it? You know, with scaffold poles or bolts, you'd want to get in there. And I'm sure the French have already explored it. As I remember, it doesn't go very far, but just a very pleasant place. Well, all that was written up in the Craven Pothole Club journal, as we had in those days in 1975. And there's a bit of a play on words for those who know a book called 1066 and all that. I called it the PSM and all that. So not many people would perhaps have realised that something fairly significant had happened. But there we go. So the next stage of the adventure was to meet up with Chris Murray, as I was expecting to do, in Toulon and then go off to Sardinia. But let me just give you a bit more background about Sardinia so you understand where that's coming from. Well, I've been caving with John and Dave Alanak, Alan and Dave for several years since joining the CPC in '68, and there's just a picture you may not have seen before taken in Clapham car park. But after several years, I was a bit fed up with my job, and I packed it in and went off to university, to Loughborough actually, and had a very nice time there on the whole. Met various people who wanted to go caving, and I was classed as a mature student, at least in age terms. So I was able to drive the minibus, and I was a very popular person for all the various clubs that wanted to go out to play. Anyway, I met Chris Murray through Loughborough University Speleological team, and he'd been down Swildens. He loved sumps, and he gave John Worley, Dave Alanak and myself the confidence to go down diving some of the sumps in Swildens Hole. And three of us got down as far as Swildens 9. Again, I look back on that and wonder how we did it. I think the visibility was probably pretty good as it happened on that occasion. I certainly won't be up to it now. And then on the 29th of December, '74, I'd been at Loughborough for about 18 months at that point, and Pete Rose led a group of us, including the Mendip Cavers, and we went down Lost Johns and had a good time there. But this was forming relationships which, unknown to us, were going to lead on to the trip to Sardinia. So first of all, I had to get myself from the PSM over to Toulon, and that was an overnight trip again on a train via Lourdes. And the next morning, when I got off the train and met them at the station, I found that Mick Borough had some devastating news for me, which I've already mentioned, because my friend and his friend, Chris Murray, had fallen to his death a week before with that accident, the SRT accident in the Picos. And that was, well, you can imagine how we all felt. But the trip still had to go on, so we got a ferry across to Sardinia. I was reunited, thankfully, with my friends John and Dave, and we had a 10-hour ferry crossing. I came into Porto Torres at the northern end, and then for some reason, drove right down the full length of Sardinia to Cagliari, which I think is the capital, and there we pitched tents by a lighthouse. And I think that is the lighthouse, although it's so long ago I can't be sure. So here's the Lust team, 14 cavers, including some holidaymakers, crammed together on a 12-seater minibus, the one you saw earlier. And credit to John and Dave, who didn't know any of these people to start off with, but by the end of the trip, they were all best of friends. Next day, we went north up to the coast and had an expensive camp. I don't know what we were doing, but we were using salt water for our soup. It doesn't sound as though that was a very sensible thing to do. But the next day we drove up a winding mountain road to the Grotta de Sa Occa, which we'd read about, and set up camp outside of the Grotta de Subento. It was a 2-hour trip into there just to have a recce. Having travelled all that way, we were keen to have a good look around. And John recalls the initial feeling of isolation and apprehension when we were dropped off by the holidaymakers at Subento and abandoned while they went off to the seaside. And we were left to contemplate bullet-ridden road signs and the thought that local shepherds had a reputation for kidnap and banditry. So I think John slept with an ice axe under his sleeping bag that first night. There's Dave pointing meaningfully at the bullet holes. Here's the camp site set up probably 100 feet up amongst the cliffs and the rocks there, so we could keep an eye out for any bandits, any nasty bandits that were coming to get us. But that was actually at the entrance to the Subento cave system. And this is the recce we had, just for a couple of hours, as I say. I think we went down this ramp. Sorry that not all my pictures are very good quality, but this is the best I could do. The short ladder climb, then rope climb down this ramp feature, and then into a canal passage, which we managed to straddle for quite a way. Next day, we actually, that doesn't look like the campsite in the hills. That looks more like the campsite by the sea. But anyway, we'll skip over that one. The next day, we had a really big push down the Subento. We had well, I've said it was 1.5 miles of swimming. It might not have been as much as that. It certainly felt like 1.5 miles, broken only by scrambling over pure white Gower dams. There's a very good picture, black and white picture in the TPC journal that year, which John took, but it's not come out very well there. Similarly, these fantastic river passages look a lot better in colour. But you know what it's like when your voice just echoes on into the distance. Very exciting. And right at the end, we met an absolutely gigantic chamber. And Dave recalls we returned to the ridge where 2 pinpricks of light were visible far away. It reminded him of the Lake District, being at Wasdale Head on Great Gable at night. And then we got down from as far as we could go up there and scree running down several hundred feet and rejoined the others. And several hours later, we reported a successful conclusion to the exploration. Fairly basic living standards up there, but it was only for less than a week. And then John wanted a photographic trip, naturally, into Subento. And while we were doing that also, I think Dave made a link to the Sa Occa cave, which we'd first spotted when the minibus drew up, and that was 180-foot pitch. So we're having nice warm feelings now. We've had a good time around Subento. And I don't know if this was John or Dave, but somebody was really into fire blowing. I remember hearing a story once when somebody was had a bit too much to drink and they filled their mouths with petrol, but the lighter didn't work. I think it's Howard Beck who tells that story. So that was another thing to watch for, but we don't think about that too much. And we must not have been getting on very well together at this point, because the next morning there was a lynching, at least a mock lynching. And I think we'd woken up that morning and found that we'd only had about 50 pence left in the kitty to last for another 2.5 weeks. So something had gone wrong with the planning. Anyway, we went off to the seaside, and on the way we met the local cavers at Nuro, and they have a little museum there which we enjoyed viewing. And our attention then turned to this area, to the Grotto de Bu Marino, which you can see down the lower down the coast there. Our campsite was on the cliff tops, quite close to the grotto. And out of boredom one evening, we were bringing our water up from a spring or something at the bottom of the cliffs. You see that bucket that's been hauled up? And Dave and I thought, we might as well climb up the cliff, that would be a bit of fun. But we totally underestimated how difficult it was going to be, partly because the rock was so friable and we hadn't left enough time. It was practically dark by the time we got up the cliff. That was probably one of the hairiest things we ever did, actually, looking back. And the next morning we hired a boat, or I think there was a regular boat going to the grotto, and we jumped on it. Here's some of the caving team, and one or two of the holidaymakers dressed to go caving. They didn't get very far, but it was a very worthwhile trip. John recalls a massive passage swimming all the way with the first half in seawater, and then, as you might expect, the second half in freshwater as the inlet streams met together. Very interesting in terms of buoyancy when you go from salt water into fresh water. And if you've not seen this cave for yourselves, then it is absolutely beautiful, and seems to get bigger and bigger the further you go. Boat ride back to where we'd been at our campsite. And then the next day, John drove us up into the mountains. There was a checkpoint and the police warning us of bandits. So we decided that we'd abandon our plans for a while, and I think we camped outside a church. And the next morning we had a look around the village, local people dressed quite distinctively, and we didn't see any bandits, but I don't know what a bandit would look like in that situation, but there was evidence that they were around. And I had this translated a while ago. It says, the forest guard's law, do not go through here with your animals or on your own, since this is an occupied area. Occupied by what, though? Anyway, we never did find out. That was the roadblock. And we set off walking up one of the big mountains, but again, we hadn't left enough time to do it properly, and we didn't quite get to the summit. But we were abandoned then by the minibus, so we had to hitch a lift with a local shepherd who saved the day for us. Meanwhile, back at the campsite, we made an attempt to visit the Grotto Neptune, but that was a tourist trip and we missed the last entry by about 5 minutes. So it's coming towards the end of the trip now, and heading back to Porto Torres. Not quite where the red line shows. We did have to follow the roads, but I couldn't be bothered to construct that for you, as long as you get the message. Caught the ferry back to Toulon, indulged in some of the local pleasures like ice cream, and arrived about 7:30 and then drove straight up to Grenoble. Don't ask me why we wanted to go to Grenoble. I think it was more sentimental reasons. Remember, there'd been a CPC expedition there the previous year. Here's a view of the Vercors. In those days, we were allowed to camp on the plateau there. Absolutely beautiful spot. And shades of our previous trip. We walked over to, and all we knew at the time was that there'd been a massive flood, and that there were 2 bodies down there at that time. It's still not recovered. And again, I'll come back to that again in a minute. From Grenoble, we then drove to Chamonix. I don't know what we thought we were going to achieve in Chamonix, but it was, we just had a few hours to walk up to the famous Montenver Hotel, which is reached by a kind of funicular railway by tourists. I found it really hard going, to be honest. I think it was just a cracking pace that we'd set ourselves. And then there are fixed ladders that take you down onto the Mer de Glace. Here we are, innocence amongst the mountains. I would say that for myself. I've not much idea about what to do in a glacier with all the crevasses and things. And we had the classic situation where we wanted a picture of Dave Allenack and said, just take 1 or 2 steps backwards, please. And you can guess what happened. He disappeared. And it went quiet, and we walked over, and he'd fallen down a 40-foot crevasse, and mercifully had landed in soft snow. And even more mercifully, there was a 45-degree ramp, so he could extricate himself unharmed. It was a very severe lesson to us. A picture here, black and white, one of John's pictures. You can just see Dave Allenack as a little black dot standing on the glacier there. It looks better in the CPC journal of that year. So now we're heading back to Paris, get the hovercraft across to Ramsgate, and everything was written up by John and Dave in the CPC journal. Now, normally you'd think, well, that would be the end of the talk, but I've still got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to rabbit on a little bit about what happened after the PSM. Well, a few weeks later, Ruben Gomez and his mates from RSIP made a connection between SC3 all the way through to the EDF tunnel, and it took them 22 hours. So that was an achievement, I suppose. The Wessex Cave Club did an investigation of sorts into what happened to our friend Chris Murray, hoping that lessons might be learned from the tragedy. This isn't the time or place for me to go into what the lessons are. There was also a report from the National Engineering Laboratory about the rope that had plunged Chris to his death. And again, you can browse that for yourselves if you're interested. But the next sort of thread really is it's to do with the Los Tayos expedition, searching for the world's deepest cave. And you may remember that we had that GG type gantry made out of logs. The CPC had an expedition to the PSM in 1995. I recognised Russell, and there's Mike Burtonshaw. And I'm now going to show you a short video, if it works, of their trip. Just the highlights. It's an hour and a quarter long, and I've edited it down to less than 2 minutes with the help of my son. So here goes.
This is the 11th century church at Saint-Angras, behind which lies the valley up to the EDF tunnel into the Salverna, which sits underneath that hillside. The PSM continues to drain through this lot underneath this gorge, and resurges at the Caqueta Gorge down the valley.
I don't know if you can hear me now, but this is the Lepino shaft, and Mike's wife, I think, wandering around, going over to the plaques that are left for Marcel Loubens.
straight doors, right? So
yeah, even the 100-metre ones. Apparently you don't have to bounce at the bottom.
yeah, that's it, it's bouncy.
Craven just came first quick.
How far did you go down there?
I just went down.
Okay.
See you down there.
Right.
Then just walked up to find out how it was.
Well, I can tell. You got the paddle. I've got the paddle. This is the tunnel we've run. Are you meant to be towing this other one with you? Whoops.
This is 11.
Right, here we are, just a few pictures. I don't need to dwell on these, but these are some of the shots that were provided for me by Mike Burtonshaw. So there we are, and just to finish off on the links to the PSM, Fred Weffer, who was one of the American cavers, went on to become president of the NSS, which is the American equivalent of BCA. And sadly, he died in 1999, the same year as he had a book published where he combined his love of Butler Cave in West Virginia with his fantasies about guns. So if you're looking for a bedtime read, you might enjoy that. There again, you might not. Anyway, continuing, I've found through the internet that in 2008, an even higher entrance than M3 and SC3 was found, and they called it M31. And it then took the depth of the PSM to 1,410 meters, and a total of, at that time, well, currently, sorry, of over 82 kilometers of passages. So after Sardinia, we'll soon be finished now, don't worry. Dave Alanak has been keeping tabs on this much better than I have, but apparently a large group went back in 1980, as you can read for yourselves. Again, CPC members in 2010 and 2011. I'm sure that's written up in the record, but I didn't have time to investigate it. This is the way that local cavers were getting through that passage which we straddled. And there's Suventu and one or two of the other caves nearby are currently being used by astronauts, believe it or not. I think it's the chambers at the end that particularly excite them. And I think our one of our own astronauts, I think Tim Peake, went down there before he was blasted off to the International Space Station. And Dave put me onto this, that there is now a high-level traverse wire that goes across the lakes for non-wetsuited cavers. And the system is now over 9 miles long and still going. As far as the Gouffre Berger, it was the deepest cave in the world for at least 10 years. And then the title went to the Gouffre de Pierre Saint Martin. And the Berger is now ranked 28th deepest cave in the world and the 4th deepest in France. Just one other thing that came to mind when the CPC had the expedition to the Berger last year, someone noticed a big bolt on hurricane pitch, which myself and Pete Gray put in. And if you look carefully, you can see the initial CPC. And we put that bolt in because we knew that we needed a really good anchor, because remember we were doing the running ladder technique, and it's been used ever since. And even more interestingly, Peter Wilson, who's a relatively recent member of the CPC, responded on the Facebook page to say that he remembered that bolt, and he was trapped down there with that floodwater which claimed the lives of 2 cavers. And anyway, just funny how these threads intertwine and come together again. So that brings me to the end of this this talk, which it's certainly been a sentimental journey for me, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Arthur. That was really interesting, actually, and all sorts of unexpected tying up. The astronauts, they're going down because it's a sort of for isolation. Is that why they're using it?
I am not too sure. I think it may also be that the big chambers at the end are so alien to what you would normally expect. But I've not read up on it, to be honest. Somebody else. It's Dave on the call, because he was the one who made me aware of this.
I'm just fiddling about. Yeah, they use it for isolation training, or they did. So they sort of send them down there, and presumably they camp underground in the big sand chambers towards the end of the old part of the cave. We had a camp there in 1980 for about 2 weeks, underground camp. It's really quite a nice spot, nice and dry. So yeah, I guess that's what I don't know if they're doing it now, but they did do for a while, and you couldn't get into the cave. You know, it was locked up, and they were just using it as a facility, presumably allowed by the Italian government. I don't know. Yeah.
Very poignant memories of Chris, Arthur. As you remember, I caved exclusively with Nick and Chris from 1970 to 72, because I was at Loughborough then, and we always spent weekends in Mendip at Chris's house in Lytton. It was the big old mill they had then, and we used to do dives down to Swildon's Fore and things like that. Wonderful memories. And when I heard about Chris, I was absolutely devastated, you know. And I've always wanted to go to his grave, which is in the English cemetery in Bilbao, I believe. He's buried, if anybody was there, it would be a nice sentimental visit to visit him in the English cemetery in Bilbao. So a wonderful caver and a great guy.
Yeah. I've always felt a bit bad about not managing to get to his funeral, and I think I was penniless pretty much in those days, and the thought of hitchhiking down from Yorkshire was too much for me to bear.
Yeah.
But I wish I'd made the effort now.
I did go back and see his mum and dad probably 5 years after he died, so a long time ago now, and they were really pleased to see me. You know, his caving friends were still caving, and you know, Chris died doing what he loved, as they said. You know, that was the one. You'll remember, Brian, won't you? Do you remember him?
Yeah, there we go.
Yes, we do remember.
Do you remember the Murrays in Lytton, Brian?
Sorry?
Do you remember the Murrays living in Lytton?
Yeah.
I remember it all happening.
Yeah.
Because you realise Alison Moody is our next door neighbour now.
Yeah.
And I remember all happening, and because it was a very traumatic experience for. They always. Do you know actually what happened to the rope?
No.
An abrasion incident, wasn't it? I think it was an abrasion incident.
That when they'd all gone down the pitch, and they were carrying on doing quite a lot of caving below, so they were several hours away from that pitch, and there was a trickle of water going down the pitch all the time, and they reckoned it moved the rope across a very sharp flake, and during that time it abraded it to the point when Chris started going up it, it was enough to break it, and that's what they think happened. But I don't know what actually came out at inquests or anything like that. But yeah, it was very sad.
And of course, rope technology's moved on such a lot, as well as SRT technology, hasn't it? You know.
Yeah. So